Alright, so today we are testing the RX 7800 XT in Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty. We are pairing this GPU with a 12700K CPU, an i7. I'll be putting up the specs on the screen right now, but we also have 32 gigabytes of DDR4 3600 megatransfers per second CL14 memory. Anyway, so we'll be testing at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. Currently we're at 1080p and we're actually on the Ultra preset. Let me just show you. So Ultra preset, I just disable any resolution scaling. Just do it a few times because the bug still persists where it does not want to disable. So just the Ultra preset 1080p native, and right, here we go. So let me just see if I can reset the numbers correctly this time. Right, so I'm testing in this specific area. This is in a Dogtown. This is where the Phantom Liberty expansion takes place, right? So it's a very demanding area, so that's exactly why I'm testing here. I want to give you the kind of like the worst case scenario so that I don't gaslight you into thinking you'll get 140 frames per second in certain areas, and you play the game, you actually get 100 frames per second. But you can see inside our frame rate fluctuates quite a bit between 100 and 120 frames per second. So, I mean, that's normal. That's just why I test this area, right? So inside getting 120 frames per second and outside getting below 90 frames per second. So it's a pretty demanding area, this, and it's also a very good looking area with lots of lighting, shadows, NPCs, etc. And you can see even at 1080p with this CPU, we are not CPU bound. So that's pretty good. We had an average there of 102 frames per second, and our 1% and 0.1% lows are pretty respectable as well. All right, so next up, we'll just test the high preset, once again, just without any FSR. I'm not a firm believer of using FSR at 1080p or any upscaling at 1080p unless you run ray tracing and you absolutely need the extra performance. Crowd density, just to take note that if you change the settings, your crowd density does change as well. So it's not just the visuals that get a little bit of a downgrade. Some game options get changed as well. Now let's just see. I'm pressing the wrong buttons here, and there we go. So the reason why I keep on pressing the wrong buttons is because this is a 60% keyboard and it's the worst keyboard I've ever used. All right, so it's getting around, I mean, I think we're getting about 10% more performance here, 120, 130. So we were hitting 124 frames per second in that specific spot. Now it's 134 frames per second. But now you can see we are actually CPU bound. Not a lot, but they are like there. We're dropping down to 91% GPU usage. And that just means that we are now slightly CPU bound because, I mean, we do have quite a high frame rate. And the CPU can't prepare enough frames to keep the GPU fully utilized. So that's why we are a little bit CPU bound. Right, so like 1080p, even if you do enable FSR, you're going to see minor performance increases, if at all. Like as I said, your CPU bound, reducing the resolution is not going to increase your performance. It might increase the lows slightly in some areas, and some areas where you still might be GPU bound, but overall 1080p high, ultra, like it doesn't really matter. If you do play at 1080p with this GPU, then just use the ultra preset. All right, so now one thing we'll need to do is we'll just have to use the I'm just using the presets here, right? Because just to make it easier for you guys to replicate, I don't want to change too many settings at once, just to give you an idea of what the performance is like. If you want to test it yourself, just select some presets. If we do test every individual setting, we'll be here the whole day. Anyway, so just on the ray tracing medium preset, but once again, I'm disabling FSR because I want to see what the performance is at native with ray tracing. And we're still on the, I mean, it's now like a mixture of medium and high settings, right? Let me get the right buttons here, and I think that's it. All right, so we went down from, what's it, 110 frames per second to around 30 to 40 frames per second. So we lost more than half of our performance by just enabling ray tracing. It might be, we might lose slightly more if we stuck to the ultra preset, for example, but this is now, like as I said, on the RT medium preset. But the settings do seem to be a mixture between the medium and high preset, just with some ray tracing options. Not all of them are enabled, and I think that's fine because AMD's ray tracing performance is not up there just yet. In games like Cyberpunk, they are quite a little bit behind Nvidia, but other games with more light ray traced options, for instance, just shadows or reflections or ambient occlusion, they seem to be doing quite okay. But the moment you enable a lot of ray traced settings, then unfortunately it does become a little bit of a struggle for the AMD GPUs. Not to say that it's not a struggle for the NVIDIA GPUs, but they do handle it a little bit better. All right, so let's just see. I do think if we just go with FSR Quality, so if we then just use the R2 medium preset again, and then just use FSR Quality, I think we should be able to hit 60 frames per second. As you can see, ray traced reflections is not enabled when using the medium preset, and if we do enable this, the performance loss is between 66% and 75% if we enable all the ray traced options here, just based on my previous testing. So let's just do that, and we're getting around 60 frames per second. Now you have to remember this is at 1080p, right? So 1080p rendering internally at 720p. I'll put up the FSR upscaling resolutions on the screen now. Just I really can't remember all those names. Let me just reset the numbers. I think there was an autosave. Unfortunately, this game does autosave every 5 to 10 minutes. But you can see inside we are almost maintaining 60 frames per second. It's dropping below every now and again, so like not terrible if you are aiming for 60 frames per second. I am using an external capture card, so if you do see some screen tearing, that's just because the capture card records that as well. All right, so I mean we had a decent average of 60 frames per second, and that is what you are aiming for. All right, now for the final test, let's enable path tracing. So I don't think you should be using path tracing with an AMD GPU. Also, you should not be using path tracing on anything lower than a 4070 Ti at 1440p. If you do have a 4070, you can probably use it at 1080p, or if you don't mind the additional input latency, just enable frame generation. It's path tracing is extremely demanding. As you can see, once we enable path tracing, all of the options disappear. It's literally now full-blown ray tracing with additional path tracing, all that kind of stuff, right? So I'm going to leave it on the exact same settings as what we had just now, where we had 61 frames per second average, just enabling path tracing here and getting the numbers back up. So all right, the input latency is quite horrible now, and I mean, sure, it's 23, 22 frames per second. It still doesn't feel like a cinematic experience, right? So we lost more than half of our performance or our frame rate again just by enabling path tracing. So that's why I said rather not use path tracing with AMD GPUs. Sure, we can now go and enable FSR Performance, but we shouldn't be rendering internally at 540p just to try and use some path tracing options. At that point, it's just kind of pointless because you lose all visual fidelity that you gain with path tracing to like a super aggressive upscaling. That's just not worth it, in my opinion. I mean, you can do with your equipment or your hardware or what you want. That's just my recommendation, and I personally wouldn't use anything other than FSR Quality at 1080p, nothing lower than that. All right, even 1080p FSR Quality is pushing it for me. All right, so that's it for the 1080p results. Let's move over to 1440p. All right, we're now at 1440p on the Ultra preset once again, and again, just going to make sure we don't have FSR enabled here. I actually recorded this whole video last night. I had to redo it because even toggling FSR a few times, it's still applied at times, and it's just annoying. Anyway, so let me just, I'm pressing the wrong buttons again. All right, so 1440p native on the Ultra preset, and this is where this GPU actually shines, in my opinion. Like, the game looks phenomenal. I'm messing up my benchmark run here. The game looks phenomenal at 1440p on a 27-inch monitor. The lighting, rasterized lighting in this game is great. Like, ray tracing takes it to another level, but if you are not planning on using ray tracing, rasterized lighting is plenty good enough in this specific game. And if you're aiming for 60 frames per second, you'll definitely get it by playing on the ultra preset. Even though I would highly recommend not to play on the ultra preset, just to use the high preset. You do get quite a bit of a performance bump, and the game still looks plenty good. I mean, that's we'll test that right now, or not right now. First of, we'll just use FSR at these settings. You at 1440p FSR quality is actually perfectly fine. No problem with that. The resolution still looks good. There is some shimmering introduced with the upscaling. DLSS has the same issue, but we do have DLSS ray reconstruction, which does seem to help quite a bit with the shimmering effects if you use ray tracing with DLSS. All right, so sorry, I know this must be annoying, me trying to reset the numbers and stuff, but I'll get a new keyboard as soon as all the e-tailers open again. Anyway, so we went from around 70 frames per second to around 80 frames per second, and although this is not really considered a high refresh rate experience, I do consider anything above 100 frames per second high refresh rate experience. We're getting close, so if you want, you can probably just dial down a few settings and you'll be able to get 100 plus frames per second. As you can see inside here, there are definitely some areas where we are getting 100 frames per second. And as I said, this is an extremely demanding area. As you can see, there's a lot of NPCs here, and the lighting, like everything, is just very demanding. And you are guaranteed to have 60 frames per second at all times with these settings. All right, so let's now just I'm not going to go to the next setting yet. I actually just want to see what happens if we enable FSR Balanced here, right? FSR Balanced still looks fine at 1440p. It does start to introduce some blurriness, but like the text and everything, it looks okay. So I actually do play on my second system, which is an RTX 4070 system. I do play at 1440p with the DLSS Balanced whenever I can, and no complaints there. And that's even on a 32-inch 1440p monitor. On a 27-inch monitor where the pixel density is slightly higher, it'll look even better. I just could buy food. Anyway, so as you can see, we didn't gain much. Like, we are now also once again slightly CPU bound. We're not pushing the GPU to 100% all the time, or 98% all the time. Like, there we're dropping into the 80s. So I do think that DLSS quality or FSR quality at 1440p with this GPU would be your best. And there was an autosave, so just go 7 seconds back to see what the lows were like. But we had an average of around 100 frames per second here, which is pretty decent, I'd say. There's also FSR 3 mods available, FSR 3 frame generation mods, and that will push your frames per second up by between 30 and 100%, depending on your settings, your system, etc. If you are fully GPU bound, looking at around between 30 and 50%, but if you are more CPU bound, it can improve your frame rate by around 100%. All right, so I'm a little bit lost now. I can't remember which settings we used here. So this was on the ultra preset, right? So let's just go back down to native, and then we'll just use the high preset, right? All right, so 1440p native on the high preset. Let me just make double sure that everything is disabled here. So let's see. I'm not sure what the frame rate would be like. So like into around 80 frames per second, right? So pretty much the same as what we had with the ultra preset and FSR quality. Now you do have the added benefit of the increased sharpness, no more, well, less shimmering, I'd say. So for the same frame rate, sure, there would be some visual downgrades going from ultra to high, but not a lot. Like, you'll have to pixel peep to actually see that, especially when playing the game. If I have to go stand and look at something, then sure, I'll see the difference. Running around killing people, like just trying to get away from cops, etc. There's you won't notice the difference. You'll be too focused on actually playing the game. All right, and you can see on the high preset, we weren't really CPU bound, or we didn't really drop that much with our GPU usage, and we had decent performance, right? So as I said, you can you can use the FSR 3 mod to increase your frame rate even more. And from what I've seen, I've tested it myself, it's actually pretty good in this game. All right, so let's just stay with the same settings here, and we'll use FSR Quality. As I said, we will probably be CPU bound now. It's this GPU is actually quite powerful. As you can see, it's going down to 90s, the low 90s for the GPU usage there. Like, the CPU does seem to tap out at around 130 frames per second, right? And what we mean by a CPU bind is that the CPU can't process or prepare enough frames to keep the GPU busy. So, for instance, if your CPU is capable of preparing 100 frames per second, but your GPU is capable of rendering 150 frames per second, then you are CPU bound because your GPU is being held back by your CPU. All right, so that's just layman's terms, right? Okay, so pretty decent experience once again. I just play on 1440p on the high preset, no FSR, and you do get a decent experience unless you're chasing that high refresh rate experience. But unfortunately, you're not going to get 120 frames per second all the time. There will be times you get 130 frames per second, whatever, but your average would be between around 110, I'd say, during normal gameplay. All right, so let's just see if we enable ray tracing now, right? So we had around 100 frames per second. Where's ray tracing? Ray tracing used to be at the bottom. Now it's at the top. So I'm just going to enable the two settings that most people are interested in, or me personally anyway. That's reflections and lighting. So we've got reflections and lighting set to medium. We don't have any shadows, local shadows or sun shadows. These two are also the ones that impact performance the most, as you will see now. So we went from 100 frames per second to 40 frames per second, and that's not ideal. Like I said, if you do have a Radeon GPU, just be aware of what you've got, right? Just don't set your expectations realistically. Ray tracing with AMD GPUs, unfortunately, is still a little bit behind NVIDIA, and not saying that it's unusable. Obviously, if you want to play 30 frames per second, these settings are perfectly fine. But if you do want more performance, then we'll have to use more aggressive upscaling settings, and then like the game starts to lose its appeal, right? It's visually anyway. So even if we are at balanced now, we're still not. I mean, balanced is still a pretty good setting to use. We're still not getting 60 frames per second. So if we go down to performance here, what are we getting? Like, still not 60 frames per second, right? Even though we are close enough. I'm just going to do a quick benchmark run here, see what the average is. Performance at 1440p is pretty much where I'd say no, don't use it, because like you will lose a lot of visual fidelity just for some better lighting and reflections. And in this case, honestly, in my opinion, it's definitely not worth it. As you can see, even inside here, where we generally have a slightly higher frame rate than outside, we're still not averaging 60 frames per second. Not that this would be a deal breaker if you are aiming for 60 frames per second, and there was another autosave there, but like, it's just not worth it in my opinion. Once again, that's my opinion. You can do with your hardware whatever you want, no judging from me whatsoever. All right, so I think that's it for 1440p. Now let's move on to 4K. I'm just going to enable the ultra preset once again. You can see that, just ultra without any upscaling, and we'll just switch this over to 4K. Right, we're now at 4K, and the ultra preset just without FSR, as I showed you earlier. And let's see how this goes. Like, we are getting about the same frame rate at 4K ultra than what we had at 1440p with DLSS or FSR Performance with ray tracing enabled. So like 4K is 2.25 the resolution of 1440p. Like, that is, it's phenomenal how demanding ray tracing actually is and how expensive it is to run. So I mean, this is not the best experience for me personally. I do know people that play at 30 frames per second. This will be fine for them. Just enable some motion blur, and I don't know if you've got a VRR panel that goes down to 30 frames per second or 30 hertz, then this should probably be a little bit of a better experience than what I'm feeling now. The input latency is slightly high, but I mean, there are things that you can change to increase this. You can enable Radeon anti-lag, etc., to increase the or to reduce the input latency. All right, so let's see what we need to do to get some decent frame rates here, and by decent I mean 60 frames per second. All right, so let's use FSR. All right, let's just do quality. Let's see what kind of performance gains we get. So I'm not going to do a full benchmark run with these settings, so that's 46 frames per second. If we do balanced, how much is that? Balanced will almost get us 60 frames per second, and performance definitely will. All right, so if you want to play on the ultra preset, you want to aim for a consistent 60 frames per second experience. Let's just do that. Then performance is the way to go. But you can just see, just look at the popcorn maker or whatever that is. Like it's shimmering quite a lot, and that doesn't happen as obviously when rendering a native, but the more aggressive you're upscaling, the more artifacting you will obviously notice. I'm actually not going to run a full benchmark with these settings. I think we should probably play at 4K medium with this GPU. It's got enough VRAM to run at 4K, no problem at all. It's got 16 gigabytes of VRAM, but I do think that 4K medium FSR quality is probably where it's going to be at. All right, so let's see with respectable settings here what we actually need. So let's just drop this down to medium and FSR set to quality. All right, I do think we should be able to get 60 frames per second here, and we won't need to use aggressive upscaling settings. There we go. So 80 frames per second. Wait 1 second. Does this actually not need upscaling to run 60 frames per second at 4K? Unfortunately, we do need. Okay. All right. So FSR set to quality, 4K medium preset, and I mean we did get a nice boost here. You might as well play on 4K high, but you can see like, even on quality, obviously it starts to happen a little bit further away. You can see that shimmering. So just use upscaling sparingly. That's my advice. If you can get away without having to use upscaling, using the medium preset or the high instead of the ultra preset, anything that you don't need to use upscaling for to get your target frame rate, I think it's a win. But this game looks absolutely stunning in 4K. This is actually on a 27-inch 4K monitor I'm recording this, and it's really pretty. all right, let's just do one thing. I'm just going to test ray tracing at 4K quickly, just see if it's possible. I mean it won't be. I know I haven't tested ray tracing extensively in this video. It's just because, as I said, like, use it sparingly, know what you've got, and don't try and push the ray traced settings if you've got an RX 7800 XT. I'm forgetting what I want to do, so let's do the ray tracing medium preset. All right, so ray tracing medium, and then we'll use ultra performance. Okay, so FSR ultra performance on the RT medium preset here. Okay, so let's see at 4K, and we're getting 50 frames per second, 53. So now you can actually just see there's a lot of detail missing, because we are now rendering internally at 720p. It's being upscaled to 4K, and we're not hitting 60 frames per second. The game looks terrible at ultra performance upscaling. This is not a good looking game. So as I said, we got this exact same performance at 4K on the medium preset without ray tracing and without any upscaling. So you need to decide whether ray tracing is actually worth the visual downgrade that you will experience by using aggressive upscaling. And personally, I don't think it is. Right, and as we get back to the start here, I think that's going to be the end of this video. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.